Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Hello, and welcome back to day 2 of the AI ThoughtCon. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see me. So please give me a thumbs up if everything is all right so that I know. Thank you so much. Well, welcome back to day 2. Yesterday was day 1, and we traveled in time with Maria Zarifi, our keynote speaker, who kind of guided us to understand all that skepticism and uncertainty that surround AI. And we learned that it actually wasn't new, but very typical for all sorts of technological and scientific revolutions. And the core challenge, Maria told us, was not the technology itself and the fact that it's changing, but the trust that we place in the technology, a trust that can only be built through governance and stable institutions. So then we had a panel that followed up on that, took the idea of governance from theory to practice and explored the gap between talking about ethics and actually implementing human-centered AI governance. And finally, at the end of the day yesterday, we had Miguel Sepulveda, who reminded us that to earn our seat at the table, we actually must learn to tell compelling stories about our value, and he showed us how to do it. So today we're going to build on the foundation that we set during day 1, and we are going to move from the future to the present and talk about how AI impacts the people. And we're going to start with the most pressing challenges of AI, namely AI bias. And we will talk about how it impacts people and society. And then we will hear from other experts during 3 lightning talks who are working on the front lines, reshaping education, professional skills, and actually the very nature of creative work in the age of AI. So let's get started. Let me invite to the stage the 4 panelists for our panel, which is called AI, Bias, and Ethics. What must the localization industry reckon with? We have an incredible panel of experts, each bringing their unique perspective. Now, my original plan was actually to introduce each one of them. But then I saw a LinkedIn post by one of them from our very own Fabiano Sid, who is with us here today. And he wrote such a brilliant and heartfelt introduction and presentation of his fellow panelists that I realized anything I could say simply wouldn't do them justice after what Fabiano wrote. Okay, so in that spirit, I decided to make things easier for myself and a little differently. So instead of introducing the speakers myself, I'm actually gonna ask our panelists to introduce themselves briefly. Tell us who you are, or what you do. And also, when you do so, I would like to I would like you to answer one question to kick things off in a single sentence, if possible. Which one of the many forms of AI bias do you consider the most dangerous, or do you consider having the biggest negative impact on people and society, and why? So let me start with Hilary.
Hey, hope you guys can hear me. I'm so happy, excited to be here, joined by all these superstars. So I'm Hilary, and I am a big time nerd. I always lead with that just to manage expectations. I'm also a product manager. I've been in the localization industry for a long time. I've had the privilege of working at some really cool companies with some really cool people. And currently I work at Spotify as a product manager, and I manage a suite of tools that we're building, a few of which are for multilingual AI, like generating multilingual AI, translating with AI, and then like trying to do a quality assessment as well. Um, you asked about bias. This is such a loaded question. Um, but I think cultural bias, and I say that because it's um it's different, it's harder, it's much harder to detect than things like training data imbalance, although it stems from that. And I think, and I guess what I'll say is, I mean, like English semantic associations showing up in AI translations, even when they don't exist in another language, that could be an example of like cultural bias.
Thank
I'll
you.
pass to another panelist.
So let's go to Michael.
All right, I needed to find my video and audio buttons. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to be part of this. My name is Michael Reid. I am an intercultural organizational consultant. My home in Athens, Greece. I've been in this field for about 25 years. I started in the language industry. I was a translator and interpreter for about 6 years. I transitioned out of that and into higher education for a while as a language professor, but I was still in the language industry. I was an office manager at an LSP for quite a while. And then I transitioned to administration in higher education. And I was in parallel with that, I was developing a series of workshops on intercultural communication and intercultural competence. And as I did that, I realized that the two worlds that I kind of naively thought were in communication with each other, international business and language and education and DEI, intercultural communication, weren't really, right? So we have, on the one hand, international business, international education, the language industry, thinking that they're very diverse and inclusive, but having a lot of work to do still. But then, we look over here at DEI acting like English is the only language that people use when we talk about issues of equity, which I know from personal experience and from my research just isn't true and is actually anti-equity to think that. So I made it my job to build and be the bridge between those two worlds, and that is what I do for clients now. That's the short version of my intro. Short-windedness is not my strong suit, so I'm really trying hard here. The form of AI bias that is most dangerous. I know this is supposed to be one sentence, Marina. I am so sorry. I'm going to
That's
give a little
okay.
scaffolding, then my one sentence. I don't think there's one form of AI bias that is most dangerous or has the biggest negative impact across societies because societies are so varied that what might be very impactful in one society may not be as impactful in another.
Mm.
So I don't know that we can universalize like that. With that sort of said as the background, I think the biggest danger with biases about AI is it's a meta bias actually, and it's our human assumption that LLMs are culturally agnostic. And I think that is really sort of the core of where a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today come from. So that is me, and I'm really happy to be part of this discussion today.
Thank you. That was so inspiring. I already have a ton of questions, but we have here Sharif joining us from across the ocean, waking up very early. So let's wake him a little bit more up. Sharif, tell us about you, and then grab a cup of coffee.
I'm a kind of water person, Marina, but thanks. Hey, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. A lot of friendly faces. My name is Sharif Issaka. I am the founder and head of research at the African Languages Lab. And if you're not familiar with the African Languages Lab, we build state-of-the-art technologies and language resources for African languages. We won the Innovator of the Year last year with one of our technologies called Mansa, which is leading the charge in terms of African language technologies. Aside the African Languages Lab, I'm also pursuing my PhD at UCLA, and my lab is called, wait for it, Misinformation, AI, and Responsible Society. And so I know a thing or two about AI bias. My research there is on misinformation, scalable oversight of LLMs, model training, post-training, all those things. Marina, to your loaded question, which I agree with Michael, cannot be answered in one sentence. I'm really trying to not create a stratification of what bias is also more important or what's the winner of worst AI bias is. But I do think that the kind of bias that's most important and impactful is what I like to think of as bias as infrastructure. What I mean by that is this is a kind of bias which is almost insidious. It's almost invisible. It is very much entrenched and made systematic, and also very hard to detect and fix. I'll give you a few examples. Policing, for example, or making health decisions on who should get a kidney transplant, for example. who should get a job, for example. These are the kind of systems that are not just that's annoying that I couldn't use the camera wouldn't capture my face properly, but also life and death decisions. Somebody's career, somebody's future trajectory is all dictated by this. And for me, the most important piece of it is also reinforcing. If female candidates are being filtered out all the time, then female candidates are going to keep being filtered out all the time, and the cycle just continues and continues and becomes very systematic. So, Marina, that's my response to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. And yeah, my question was loaded, but by saying what is the worst bias, what I actually mean is what is the bias that has the most critical impact on society, the one that is hardest to mitigate. Yeah. So thank you. Go grab the water then if you are not a coffee person. Now let's go to Fabiano, who just landed in Europe. So from across the ocean, probably jet lagged. So please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Marina. Yeah, I'm so happy that we're doing this. I remember when we started talking, you, Hilary, and I, about the possibility we added Michael and Sharif later, and this is so exciting. So thank you, the AI localization think tank for hosting us. I'm Fabiano. I have a translation background. I was a translator, then became an entrepreneur, and sold the company twice. And more recently, I have this amazing job of Chief Solutions Officer at PowerLink. And in this position, I managed to pivot into learning much more about technology that I didn't have access before, just because of, being an LSP, it's usually we don't have as many resources as the rest of the more resourceful companies. But in that position, I managed to create room and space to start talking about things that were very personal to me, including bias. So in the past year, I talked about it in Monterey for Lockroad, and then online for the Gen AI localization about bias mitigation. And yeah, this is more how it is. I'm also on the board of Women Localization, and I am leading a beautiful project called the WIGS, Underrepresented Interest Groups, that will be launched soon. But I'll be happy to talk about it with whoever is interested. And for those out there, I think it's important that we start talking about this. Is something that my pronouns are he and him.
Thank you very much, Fabiano. So let me start with the interrogation or the questions, and I'm gonna follow up from.
I never answered.
You didn't answer. Yeah, you didn't. So are you gonna answer that?
I think
what is the most impactful bias for you? The one that
the
keeps
most
you up at night?
negative and impactful is the bias that we don't talk about. And I think what we're doing here is exactly reverting that situation. It's either the bias that we don't talk about, or that we take for granted, or that we pretend that it's just complaints for or victims and victimizing people. So this is the one that we have to fight.
Yes. Thank you. That was a very unexpected answer, but a creative one. So now let me revert back to what Michael said when talking about the DEI. You said something which caught my ear. You said people think that English is the only language people use. And we know that a lot of the state-of-the-art models, the most powerful, biggest models, AI models out there, are actually trained on data scraped from the internet, which contains between 70, I've seen even numbers like 25% of English language data, and the remaining small portion is for all the other languages in the world, which are about 6,000 or like 5,999 languages, right? So inevitably training models on English, thinking that's the only language people use, will have impact on how those models then interact with the users, what they produce, and so on, which brings us to the cultural bias as well. So maybe that's a question actually to you, Fabiano. You had a talk on the cost of English-only AI. What is the economic repercussion of that, right? So just even thinking from a pure business perspective, what does it mean if we have English-only AI? We will then talk about the other consequences.
So the presentation was about that, the hidden costs of English-only AI in sales, marketing, and the lives of patients. Imagine, if you train the models and if the data is comprised of only what we call weird, Western, English,
Educated,
educated,
industrialized,
industrialized,
a rich
democratic,
democratic societies.
which, yes. So we're removing a huge part of the population out of the scope of the generation of these models. There's a beautiful project called the Gender Shades Project, and two researchers, they reached out to they analyzed several facial recognition systems. I think, Sharif, you mentioned this in your opening. And they saw that there is a range between the precision of white male and black female. It gets to 34%. The lack of precision between those two groups, even though they created a very vast corpus of people and systems, the differences are those. And if you imagine that these are systems used to do, passport scanning, but also law enforcement, immigration, and even health, you see the results that can come out of this. But then again, language too. How are we talking? How our brands are talking to their audiences, and not only in terms of population, but also in terms of generation. We talked about it during our preparations, a generational gap between the corpus that is being built with old data and how are we talking to the Gen Zs and Gen Alphas that are now becoming good consumers. So the data is based on Boomer and Gen X, while the Gen A, Gen Alpha, and Gen Z populations are the new consumers, but they are not reflecting their lingo and their the speech.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabiano. Yeah, and just to continue this thought a little bit further, right? So when we have AI models trained on predominantly Western data or English data, they develop this type of a weird personality or like Western personality, and they adopt Western cultural values. So that brings me to the biggest concern that Hilary had, and that is the cultural bias in AI. So Hilary, can you tell us a little bit more about the cultural bias in AI? Why it worries you, and how does it actually play out in real life? Like, what are examples of cultural bias in AI, specifically in our industry?
Sure. So there's a lot of examples. I've written on my Substack about a very beautiful term, semantic leakage. It's just something you want to say all the time. And that's where, associations are showing up in AI translations or text generation for other languages, even when they don't exist. So, like, for example, if I say, generate a motivational message for employees. My employees are having a tough quarter and I want to send them a motivating message. In English, that might look like, push through, rise to the challenge, like you've got this. It's this kind of individual hero narrative. But I used to work at a Japanese company, for example, and maybe for a difficult quarter, it would probably be more important to like acknowledge the burden that the group is carrying together, express some gratitude for the collective effort that everyone gave, and frame it as a challenge that we were navigating together. So this is an example of AI maybe generating a correct, linguistically correct message, for example, in Japanese, but it's incorrect from a cultural standpoint. And this is called semantic leakage. So the researchers who come up with beautiful names, this is what they call it. There's tons of examples. This is like a growing area of research that's really well documented, actually. And they show that all the frontier models, regardless of the language that they're generating in, exhibit English, US-centric, and even Protestant, interestingly, cultural values, is what the research has shown.
Yes, thank you. And just to give a concrete example of semantic leakage, which I learned about from Hilary's Substack, by the way, and I want to, Hilary has this fascinating educational series that is really an eye-opener. I do AI day in, day out, and I still learned a lot from her work. So I really encourage you to go and follow her. But just a concrete example of semantic leakage that is culturally conditioned. If you send a prompt to a model saying his favorite color is yellow, he works as a, and then you ask the model to continue that prompt, right, to generate the completion, the model will tell you his favorite, his job, he works as a bus driver, associating the color yellow with the school bus, school bus driver, associating the color yellow with school buses because they're yellow in US and Canada. So there comes a semantic leakage, which actually encodes a cultural specificity. As far as I know, only in India, US and Canada are school buses yellow. So that would be a valid kind of correlation, even though it's totally illogical for just a couple of countries in the world. Yeah, so that's semantic leakage. Also, thanks to Hilary, I discovered an article which shows that LLMs, not only large language models, not only have this kind of cultural logic baked deep inside them, but they also even think in English. So even if they produce outputs in another language, their thought process is intercepted, with the kind of intermediate latent states of the thinking process, their thought process is in English. Yeah, so too much bias here. But okay, so a question to, let's say Sharif, because Sharif is working on African AI models, right? So you've created this very powerful Mansa LLM called after the richest man in the world, which is multilingual. How do you ensure that it's also multicultural, right? Because we've seen from kind of English-centric AI models that even if they can produce fluent output in multiple languages, they still have the Western-centric culture deeply ingrained inside them. So for Mansa LLM, did you have to do something special to ensure that it's not only multilingual, but also multicultural?
Yeah, great question, Marina. I think I would start by saying, in as much as we are saying that bias exists in English, we're not necessarily saying English or these weird languages are bad in itself, right? Like English is not evil just because it's the most widely used languages in the world. I don't think anybody here is trying to say that. So I think I just want to set the stage clear on that. The issue of multilinguality and multiculturality, there's a correlation, but they are not the same. Now, here's an example that, and this is maybe a personal example. I'm sure all of you have spoken to somebody who might know a lot more about your country than you, even though they're not from your country. At least I have felt that. Like, so like, oh, this guy did this footballer from your country. I'm like, dude, I have no idea who this is, but yeah, good to know. I think the same thing can be deduced into an LLM that it is possible to train an English-only LLM to be multicultural, right? I mean, think about it. If we teach an LLM in English how to all of Greek culture or whatever, or the Bantu people's culture, but in English, it's still going to get the cultural context, but it's not going to be multilingual. Vice versa, it's possible to teach the models to be able to do translation or do work in a multilingual setting, but not have the culture associated with it. It can just learn to map the sentences from one language to the other one in the semantic embedding, and then do the translations for you. So that's my long way of saying multilinguality and multiculturality are not the same thing. And bringing it to Mansa, at the end of the day, the biggest issue is it comes to the data. I feel like at this point, everybody is probably on the same page with that. That if we train a model that, Marina, like you said, some of the early models had 90 to 95% English representation, and you have that small space that you're squeezing all of the remaining 7,000 world languages into, well, you know what you could get. And so with Manta, we start with the careful process of saying, how do we design this model with multilinguality, not as a side effect or as an afterthought, but really that's the central premise, because that's what we are trying to do. And that's the case for a lot of these things. Marina, you gave the examples of the models thinking in English, or with, for example, with the Quen models thinking in Chinese. It's a design choice to some degree, right? That the models want to optimize and gain more reward, and whatever language gets them there the easiest is the way they're going to do it. So it's not the model's fault; it's the designer's fault. And so with Manta, we start with, well, even the tokenizer stage. We say, how can we build a tokenizer that can encompass a lot more world languages rather than these Latin scripts, right? We start with that, we collect more data, we work with the individual communities, we make the conscious decision to say, we want our model to be multilingual from the ground up. And so Marina, feel free to ask more questions, but I don't want to give a long response. But I think it's the intentionality of it. We intentionally go out, collect data that is designed to make our models multilingual. That's sort of the key to solving that problem.
I could be just sitting here listening to you, Sharif, until we are out of time, but I have to ask you one more question, okay? You'll get 2 questions in a row exceptionally, simply because of what you said about going out to communities collecting data. So Michael shared this fascinating, no, who was it? I think Hilary maybe, shared as we were preparing an article about participatory AI. It was either Michael. Yeah, okay, one of you guys. Okay, and in participatory AI, the idea is that when AI models are built, they are not built by kind of a secluded Silicon Valley provider team, to serve communities that are sitting in India, Thailand, or Ghana, but they are actually built, models are built with the active participation of the future users of the models, right? And this is especially relevant when you want to have a model that is serving minorities or like special cultures such as Maori or whatever culture there is, right? So as you mentioned, going out there and working with communities to create data and annotate data, it reminded me very much of the participatory AI idea. So did you use that kind of model when building Mansa LLM, like collaborating in a mutually beneficial relationship, right, with the data providers?
Right. So I think I'll start off with the piece that you also began with, which is sort of the worldview of how these models are even built. I do not, or I hope that people are not inherently evil to say, I want to build a model that's going to screw over some population. I hope not. That's just my hope for humanity. For example, I've always thought it's about participation and who is in the room. There's that popular quote that if you're not at the table, you're something like that. If you're not seated at the table, you're gonna be had for dinner. Something like that. Anybody knows the quote? Okay, something along those lines. And I've always thought about it this way. For example, the computer vision example, Fabiano, that you gave. If think about it this way, if the people building the computer vision were in the room and they're like, yeah, white, it works great. And then they show it to somebody with a person of color, like, oh no, it doesn't work. They'll be like, guys, this doesn't work. Let's go back and recalibrate. But because somebody like that was in the room, nobody sees it. It's just insidious. It just slips right in and nobody ever notices. And so, Marina, tying this back to the question about involving community, the same thing. I remember in some of the early models, this is a mistake we made as part of the African Language Lab, but one of the earlier models we trained to answer menstrual and sexual health questions in rural areas. I remember a young girl asked the question, where can I go to get menstrual products? And guess what? The model told them to go to Walmart, okay? And this is somebody in rural Ethiopia. There is no Walmart, right? And so these are all things you want to take into consideration. And so how we get around that is, yes, Marina, how do we work with these communities? We're not here to just extract and take, but how do we build together? How do we build systems that are mutually beneficial? How do we build in such a way that you know that your communities are going to be part of this? Oh, go back to the example I just gave. We work with this community. And guess what? They were like, yeah, we see where the issue is. We described the problem. they worked with us to collect data that's very, very specific to their community. And of course, in the next version of this chatbot, it wasn't saying go to Walmart. It was saying go to that local store next to you, or speak to your school counselor or your auntie. It's able to then understand these cultural nuances that are very, very specific to this target group.
Thank you. Thank you. Super, super interesting insights. Thanks so much for sharing your basically hands-on experiences with building actual models. Okay, so we all agree, models that are culturally insensitive, that's a bad thing. And we already saw a lot of examples of that. But now let me bring it kind of closer to our audience, which to a very large extent consists of translator, language professionals. Like even though each one of us may end up in a situation of being a user interacting with a customer service AI chatbot and getting annoyed at the tone or the approach, right? I want to kind of anchor the conversation from now on in our actual industry, right? We are talking localization. We are talking transforming content written in a particular source language into other languages in order to serve other markets. So, Fabiano, I guess you will be positioned to answer that question from your kind of managerial and marketing point of view. Like, how does that culture bias get instantiated like in the localization and translation industry? What does it mean? Because nobody's asking like, where can I get menstrual whatever pads. In our case, people are reading websites, people are reading UI. How does that show to the users? You are muted. No worries.
Sorry. I think it shows in every sense, as we have seen, but I think on the other hand, the detection, we talked about detection and mitigation, and it was one of the questions that we were discussing before here, and how can we mitigate bias in the models. And I think we in localization have a prominent role in mitigating bias, because the very concept of localization is to bring the local culture and the local aspects and the local language into the game. Hilary has been saying this, a lot of people have been saying this, that it's time not only for us to upskill, but also to reclaim our role, a more prominent and crucial role in this whole process. I mentioned this in Lisbon at a conference. If we start saying large language models, we get back into the system. It's not artificial intelligence. We put the human back in the core of the process. And if we talk about large language models, we are the language people. We need to talk about how can we contribute to this, and not let people pretend or assume that we don't have a relevant role in this process. I think localization is perfectly positioned to not only have a more prominent role in the definition of how this is going, where this is going, but also mitigating the bias that we have with the use of English-only AI.
I love that, because I think that this gives us, first of all, a very bright outlook for, our actual role here, because here we have a problem. Everybody's sitting with this problem. I recently talked with a Silicon Valley researcher about culture fine-tuning and kind of solving this cultural bias of AI model. And he shared that this is the big thing in Silicon Valley right now. That is like the $1 billion question. How do we build models that are culturally sensitive and attuned to the users anywhere, right? So I really love this idea.
One more thing.
Yes.
Sorry, before we go. I've had a conversation with Sharif, and I think this is important too, for us to realize that we're not making a favor, and nobody's doing us a favor by letting us reclaim this space. we had a conversation. I had a conversation when I met Sharif. Someone he said, I'm developing the African language labs, and the person asked, "Oh, is this a charity?" And he
Yes.
said, "Why do you always assume that Africa has to do with charity?" No, it's very strategic and very profitable. So I think this is the claim that we have to make as well. I'm going to solve your problem because once your model starts ruining, I will be there to solve your problems because I know what I'm doing. It's not only the statistical things, there's the cultural human aspect that I know about. And I'm going to save your.
Yes. Thank you. But let me be provocative here. And poor Hilary, she will have to answer my provocative question. Right. So if we say that it's the localization folks who are best positioned to solve the culture bias problem in AI, and at the same time, we have this trend towards involving the human less and less in the processes that lead to the output from localization, right? We have human in the loop, human on the loop, human outside of the loop, observers, whatever, right? So how do we solve that? How do we, on the one hand, bring in the human touch, like the human cultural fine-tuning, and at the same time, we are moving more and more into AI first, machine first, and so on. I see a paradox here. And I know Hilary is building, she is actually building the AI solutions. And I'm sure you have thought about this very same paradox.
It's a paradox, and it's a difficult thing for our industry to wrestle with, for sure. I will say the alternative to us not leading this is someone else will, and they already are. And so if we don't step in and lead this, because it's not, I think there's two debates here. The one is, should this technology exist? Should this work continue to live with humans? That's one conversation. And then the other conversation is, how can we work to ensure that what is being built reflects the needs of the global community and reflects our needs, because we will have to use it. We will have to use it. We're going to be forced to use these systems. And if we don't get involved now, we're going to be like cornered and having to use systems that we didn't help build, that we didn't help infuse with our knowledge, that don't work on a global scale. And that's not a good place to be. And I do truly think that it's not too late for us to build with AI differently. I have actually a lot of hope, and I think that our industry is so perfectly positioned to lead right now in this moment, because we've been dealing with these problems for literal decades. We know how to assess quality in millions of word projects. We know how to infuse cultural relevance in content. We know how to we have error typologies. These guys are writing error typologies today. There's a job, reliability engineers. They write error typologies for AI outputs. They've never done it before. We have. So we can really lead in this space right now. Michael, I'm curious. I know me and you have had several conversations about this, and I want to hear your thoughts.
I think, and I'm going to sort of take a step back here because there's something that you said, Sharif, that I thought was really interesting, and it's tied into what you just said now, Hilary, because you were saying that it can be, and I really like, Fabiano, that you make that precision of saying LLMs instead of saying AI, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about LLMs. So let's be very clear with what we mean. This idea that you can be multicultural without being multilingual, I'm not sure how much I agree on that. Now, you can be in a certain sense. For example, the US and the UK and Australia, broadly speaking, share a language and have different cultures. But I feel like it's a bit of a stretch too far to say that you can, without speaking Greek, have that intimate understanding of Greek culture, or without speaking Kiswahili, have that intimate understanding of a Bantu culture or something like that. I wonder if we can really go. And I fear that that kind of thinking is what leads us to the position we are in a bit in the localization industry, where we have almost unquestioned sometimes, we have people who are perhaps self-styled, but anyway, localization experts or multiculturality experts who are completely monolingual, which means they're Anglophones because only Anglophones are allowed to be multilingual, even in the language industry. Let's not forget that. But so I feel like we might be working against ourselves if we go too far down that road. But I totally understand your point. Like I do think what you're saying is really legit. To your point, Hilary, I agree completely. And this is sort of pulling in that idea too about this isn't charity. This is just reclamation of our rightful space. This bizarre mechanistic view of language, right? And this weird trend that the language industry has gone into, which is kind of language flavored tech instead of actually language, I think is what part of what has created this rift. And so we need to get back in and say, no, language is not just a dry mechanistic skill set. It is a relational concatenation of largely non-quantifiable identity propositions. And you need to have that non-quantifiable and intangible knowledge to be able to manipulate it properly as a human, as a meaning-making organic being does, because that's what language is. And so I don't think it's too late, but I do think that we do need to reconcile that not all goods or not all goals in this area are going to be commensurable. But we also need to realize that they're not all created equal, right? Somebody who says, no, but I think we should do this because this is what the tech can do and it makes us money. Okay, congratulations, but you're wrong. If you want to deal with language, you are wrong. You're not dealing with language, you're dealing with some kind of simulacrum of it that will probably fill your pockets until you can cash out. Congratulations, but you're not doing language. And so I really feel what you're saying there, Hilary, because I think it's about the language industry being about language again, instead of, like I said, language flavored tech or language flavored business or whatever.
Marina, if I'm able to respond real quick? So, Michael, I am in full agreement with you there. I am not saying that a monolingual model is a multicultural model. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm the first author on the paper that shows that it's called translation as a scalable proxy for models performance.
Mm-hmm.
What we show in this paper is translation alone. If you're good in translation, that means you're good in translation let me take a step back. If you're good in Swahili translation, that means you're probably good in Swahili multiculturality. So basically what you're saying, I'm putting a research on it that yes, that's something I have validated myself, paper that I've published. And so I don't disagree with you. What I'm trying to say, to be clear, is let's think about languages that are not written, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You can still find cultural information about these languages from LLMs.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not removed. And so you don't necessarily have to have a language even written to have some cultural information about the language.
Yeah.
That's where I'm saying that they're correlated, but you don't need both of them to be true at the same time, right? Because if that's the case, you never have a non-written language being represented culturally in LLMs.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. You're absolutely right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Guys, just go on. You don't need me here. Okay. Okay, but here is something that I have been wondering about, and it comes to the erosion of the linguistic skills of translators, the way they are primarily being used currently in the industry, and that is as post editors. So I have seen this shift towards what Michael says, and it hurts me as a linguist, and I think it hurts everybody to see that. the shift to kind of a converting the very creative process of translation into a mechanistic error detection and error correction process called empty post editing or whatever that is. There is even a trend towards pushing it even forward, like further, and having translators or humans in the loop validate AI translations or LLM translations and detect hallucinations and so on, which is like really going, it becomes very different type of task than actually translating, which is converting from one culture to another through language, right? So my concern has been, are we creating a generation of new linguists or like new kind of a specialists that actually have those skills eroded, the cultural conversion skill, and they're becoming more mechanistic post editors, who work with the outputs from machines? Fabiano, and unmute yourself.
I
Yeah.
just wanted to raise my hand because Cristina here in the chat is talking about something very similar. She's saying, are we trying to reclaim that role that we lost with the advent of machine translation when we became just post editors? Is this the right time? And are we late in the game? So it's just to combine the question. And if I may
Yes.
start the discussion, I think it's the sheer volume of data. And before, I think my impression is that with machine translation, we're talking about content. Here we're talking about every decision made in a company potentially made by AI. It's not only the translation of content, it's the decision-making process everywhere. Who gets to get right insurance? Who gets to jump the queue in the hospital service? So I think this goes beyond translating websites or even legal documents. It's a little bit, so yes, we need to reclaim, and yes, we're already late. But just to add to your question, Marina, I'll let you decide who you want to ask that
No, we
question.
are not late. No, we are not late, because there is, I'll finish on a positive note, okay? I just want to
Good.
finish on a
We
positive
did
note
that.
before we move into questions from the audience, because we have quite a few. I don't think we are late, Cristina, and thank you for bringing that question. And the reason I don't think we are late is because more and more LSPs and general translation service providers are now pivoting towards not only providing translation, but also the cultural layer on top, right? And we need a new type of specialist. And I can see that also from my daily work. We need a new type of specialist, one that is not only a linguist, but also a cultural specialist. And that you don't have. The culture, you cannot at this moment impose it through technology. This still remains so uniquely human that I think that all the linguists who feel disencouraged, who feel that the value of their work is diminishing, they should pivot to become the cultural ambassadors. And I think this is a trend that will persist. So we thank you so very much. We could have spent the night talking. I really feel like really sad that we need to finish this panel. I hope we can continue the conversation some other time. So thank you so very much for sharing your wisdom and knowledge and thoughts. We have questions in the Q&A, so let me pass the word to my colleagues from the think tank, Marta, who's been monitoring the questions. So what will you choose for us?
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. There's a lot to unpack. Thank you very much to our panelists. It's been equally inspiring and shaking all our very own internal biases. And thank you already for managing Christina's question, which was very insightful. So for the time that we have, there are like no questions on YouTube streaming. So I'm encouraging everyone to add their questions. But the one I would like to share with you through the Q&A, and as a segue to what we were wrapping up and how this impacts the localization industry and what we can do next, Remy was asking about how localization can actually keep control that it deserves both language and the industry and translators in the enterprise environment today. How can we actually position globalization to be central to the business value and make it a proposition that is equally ethical and authoritative?
Would like to take this?
I'll start with a very quick, brief comment. I I never really understood why folks in localization are super worried about LLMs, say, taking their jobs and whatnot. And I say this because we basically have been saying that the whole issue with LLMs is that they're just not multilingual, they're not multicultural. And that's our jobs. So why are we worried about that? Like we're saying they are not, that's the issue. I'll just stop there.
Well, I think that the idea here is that linguists feel that their job is actually being taken over by machines, right?
For
So
the high resource languages, I could see something
yes,
there. Yeah, for the high resource languages, yes.
exactly. So that is the main concern. But this reminds me actually of what Maria Zarifi said yesterday at the keynote. So she brought in her kind of philosophy of science perspective. And when she was talking about the Luddite movement, right, the ones like in England during the Industrial Revolution, there were this group of people who were going into factories and destroying the looms because the looms were actually taking away the manual work from people. So her note was, it is a misconception to think that the Luddites were anti-technology. They didn't resent the technology. They resented the social change that this technology brought with it and the way that was handled. So our responsibility is not like shut down the LLMs. No, it's not against technology. It is like keep using LLMs, but at the same time, convert the tasks, the workforce to an equally fulfilling and value creating and creative type of work without diminishing their values. That is the important thing. I see, Michael, that you have your hand raised.
I just wanted to say on that point of, how can we claim our spot at the table and everything like that? Because I noticed that thread sort of running through the conversation that we've been having. And I think part of it is really, and it's going to sound like I'm saying what I said before, but really leaning into what it is that we do, which is language, and why it is that we do what we do. You know what? To be very honest, get a little baffled sometimes when I hear these conversations about how do we sell our value and what kind of story do we tell? Our value is that there's more than one language in the world. Like, why do we do what we do? Because there's more than one language in the world. Like, it's very, very simple. And if you're getting pushback on that, if people aren't understanding that because they have their own linguistic bias going on and think that English is good enough for everything, start questioning. Why is it? That's what we do in DEI. We don't just look at the manifestation, we look at the root, we look at the cause. Why is this happening? Right? Something that is dead simple, there's more than one language, shouldn't be a struggle. If it is a struggle, what are you doing to address the root of that struggle? How are your practices reflecting something that addresses that struggle and puts the lie to that argument?
Thank you, Michael. So let's give the closing words to Hilary, because we need to leave a few minutes for a break.
No pressure. Yeah, I really believe that we have to claim our role in this space. And I see in tech that multilingual AI systems, they're being designed by people who genuinely think, they believe that like multilingual means, run the same prompt through 100 languages, or for example, evals, LLM evals. Everyone's heard about these. It's people, they actually say like, Claude, assess the grammar of this this paragraph. And it does okay for some languages. But what we need to do is be very clear and position our expertise, like I mentioned, because we have it. You know, ML engineers, they're truly brilliant at like model architecture, maybe training optimization, but they don't have the frameworks for evaluating culture appropriateness, detecting linguistic bias, understanding regional market dynamics, designing workflows for hundreds of languages. Like we have that expertise, and you have to come to the table and say, "Hey, I see what you're doing. It's really cool. Let me help you make it better and bring my decades of expertise so that we can build something that actually meets the use case of your 50 languages or whatever it is that you're serving, and bring your expertise to the table. And like bring them, you know, let's say they're doing LLM evaluations the way I explained. Say, let me help you. I'll run an evaluation, and then we can compare notes and let's talk about it. Try to shift from like oppositional. There's a
Yes.
saying that I really like, instead of like pulling on two ends of a rope where there's a knot in the middle, to both people stepping back and say, how can we untie this together? Like, let's try and figure out how to untie it. And we can help them untie it, tie a better knot, whatever analogy you want to put in there. But we really have to step up and claim our seat and claim our expertise and offer it to the business.
Thank you, Hilary, for these very nice closing words. We are out of time, and we have, so thank you really very much. This has been absolutely amazing, very thought-provoking, and I feel I am much smarter and richer after this panel. We are now going to have a 3-minute break, like really 3-minute break, because at the hour sharp, we are having more for you. We will welcome Jos Moorkens to the stage, and he will talk about how can we actually prepare people to meet the new challenges and still have valuable work in this new age. So he's going to talk about how we teach translation in the age of generative AI. So see you in now 2 minutes. Yeah, so just go grab a glass of water and come back. Thank you so much. See you in 2 minutes. So, hello. We are back again after a short break. We gave you 1 minute more. And yes, so I hope you're back in front of your screens, and I hope you enjoyed the first panel. We have more exciting things for you for the remaining 1 hour and a half, where we're going to listen to 3 lightning talks, one after the other without any breaks. So I hope you took your cup of tea or water. Yeah, so during the panel, we actually finished the panel talking about the role that we have to play in this new world, new AI-dominated world. And this brings a very important question, like how do we prepare language professionals to play their role in this new world? So we are lucky to have with us today Joss Moorkens, an associate professor at Dublin University, who actually isn't just an academic. He is at the very front line shaping the curriculum for the new language professionals, observing how they're evolving, what their careers are. And even he wrote a book about that together with colleagues. He published a book on the topic. The book is called Teaching Translation in the Age of Generative AI, and it is available for free. So I really encourage you to go and download it because it's full of very interesting insights. So Joss is with us here today to share what is happening inside translation programs in the age of generative AI, and how do we shape education in the age of AI. Joss, our pleasure to have you here today.
Marina, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Belen, to Stavrola, and the rest of your localization think tank for organizing this. This has been a great event so far. I popped the link for the book. It's free of charge to download. It's co-edited by myself, Masaru Yamada, and JC Pennett. That's the cover there on the right. And that's why we have the title of this talk today. I'm not suggesting this is the only way to teach translation or translation technology in the age of generative AI, but just this is a few ideas from things we've done, things that people wrote about in the book. And for the next 20 minutes, I'll go through some changes in the roles our graduates take in content, the things that we teach, pedagogy, the way that we teach it, and assessment, how we evaluate our students at the end of it. So for those of you that might have been at the European Language Industry Survey launch, the report launch, 13, 14 days ago now, there was a little said about that was relevant to the change of our graduates' roles, how language companies' growth plans focus strongly on post-editing, but smaller, they called services such as content creation, transcreation, voice services, quality evaluation, and localization that are getting considerably more attention, and that the role of language professionals and language companies is gradually shifting from pure production to a broader spectrum of language-related services. And we can see here that the sort of split between the focus on cost, maybe on post-editing and edging out human work, or expanding value and expanding the offering for those other so-called smaller services. And that's been our experience at DCU, at Dublin City University, for probably about 10 years. We haven't really produced very many translators at all. Our graduates have moved into roles that are related to translation or multilingualism at the intersection of languages, cultures, people, and technology, with a focus on ethics as well, as mentioned in the last panel. We produce translators for English-Irish because there's very few English-Irish translators, and the technology is not quite as effective at translating. So there's a real need, especially at European level, for English-Irish translators. But other than that, we produce relatively few translators. But our graduates do get interesting and challenging and satisfying jobs. And we thought initially that was just our experience because we're in Dublin, where there's a lot of tech headquarters, there's a lot of startups, it's a headquarters for the localization industry. But this article by Esther Bond in 2018 talked about the stunning variety of job titles in the language industry. And that really demonstrated that this was more widespread than just for ourselves in Dublin. Also, we need to make sure that we don't focus on our own way of seeing the world. As Paulo Freire said, that while there is our own way of knowing, we need to make students aware that there are other ways of knowing beyond our own, that there isn't just this sort of narrow view that we have ourselves. And we need to satisfy students, some of whom are technology critical, others who want to market themselves as AI experts and quite successfully do so almost immediately after graduation. An article by Yu Hao and Anthony Pym, looking at graduates from the University of Melbourne in 2022, found that only about a third find employment as translators or interpreters, but about half of them tend to find employment using multilingual communication skills in various capacities. And they concluded that it was important to assess the wider range of jobs and the transferable skills that they require. And that seems to be an experience that is replicated across the European Masters in Translation network, speaking to colleagues across Europe, that their graduates are increasingly moving into a wide spectrum of roles that don't necessarily mean that they translate day to day. So over time, we've updated the European Masters in Translation competence framework. That there's still a lot of wriggle room within this framework, but it dictates to a broad extent what's taught at master's programs across Europe. We're currently updating this framework. I had a 2-hour meeting about this earlier today, and we should have the latest competence framework published towards the end of this year, around October. So there's a lot of discussion going on. And this has responded to changes in the industry, this sort of broadening spectrum of roles, and to research and essays from different research groups like PACTA in Barcelona, DataLit MT, Ralph Kruger's group looking at data literacy, and now more broadly at AI literacy for translation, the Effort group based in Geneva, and with some of the PACTA people, and LT Leader, our group trying to increase AI literacy for educators, and lots of others. So we're trying to look at skills for a broader range of roles in a very dynamic environment, the sort of environment that we spoke about in the last panel, and inculcating this idea of digital and AI literacy. For us, technology has long been a key selling point. Since we started our master's program in 1992, that's been the focus, and it's been key for us, as increasingly that's the biggest skill deficit identified in the industry. It's been mentioned in successive LS surveys. It's in demand from the European institutions, so we're very much involved with the Directorate General for Translation at the EMT network, and there's this constant pressure to upgrade technology teaching. And in our free book, there's a chapter by Lynn Bowker, pictured here on the right, where she talks about working with data, which is becoming key. I mean, often we talk about the interaction of people and technology, but really it's people and data, because it's all data-driven technologies these days. And Ralph Kruger, he's written about AI literacy for translation and has defined what sort of headings that there might be for this. We can see a picture of Ralph here on the right, drawing from the ideas of AI literacy that were put forward by Long and McGurko in 2020, the ability to critically evaluate, communicate and collaborate with and use AI, and Laupicler et al., the ability to understand, use, monitor and critically reflect on AI applications without necessarily being able to develop AI models. So Ralph's model involves understanding the technical foundations of AI, determining the domain-specific performance, interacting adequately with it, implementing AI in language and translation industry workflows, and crucially considering the wider ethical societal aspects of AI. And that last part is key, and it's something that I've been very much involved with in my research. There is this increasing importance of ethics, and specifically data ethics, computer and technology ethics. So that involves teaching students about theories of ethics. So be that consequentialism, what will bring the best result, what decision will bring the best result for most people, or virtue ethics. If you try and follow certain virtues, will that lead you to the best result? Or deontology, having a set of guidelines. By following those, will you make ethical decisions? And part of that is actually using images such as this one from Better Images of AI that don't try to hide the less pleasant implications of AI. Don't have someone looking wondrously through a set of goggles that somehow is meant to make us think of AI being wonderful, but instead shows the pros and cons. We use case studies, which I'll talk about in a moment, and have class discussion and have frameworks for trying to understand our entangled role. And that's what myself and Gökhan Dugro wrote about in our chapter in this free book, to try and understand and respond to ethical issues post-graduation for our students, so that when they're faced with a decision, that they even understand that it is an ethical decision and have a framework to try and produce the best result for the most people. So this is Gökhan here on the right. He's based in Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And there is this growing sense that technology affects our ability to live a good life, a life that's respectable, a life that's admirable, that sort of helps others. And questions of ethics, they tend to provoke discussion amongst our students. They allow for student input. We can think about the impact on lots of people across translation workflows, the creators, translators, who may or may not be affected by the sort of derivative work status of copyright, the annotators who annotate data, who maybe work on reinforcement learning using human feedback, end users of technologies, the impact on the environment. And there's a tendency in ethics writing to only think of these in a negative way, but are they only negative? There might be positives too. I've done a recent piece of research with Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, where we're looking at the use of LLMs for translation with oversight of patient discharge instructions. So for them, 20% of their patients speak a language other than English, be it Brazilian Portuguese, Latin American Spanish, Arabic, or Haitian Creole. And by potentially using technologies, we could have statistically significant health improvements by speeding up the translations and also eradicating some of the errors from the process. There's a lot to say about that, but I might answer about it if there's any questions to do with it. So there are potentially positive uses of AI, and there is the whole AI for good push. There's the sort of thing that Sheriff was talking about in the last panel. There is Amy Van Winsberg's work on AI for sustainability that she feels is intrinsically linked with the sustainability of AI. So for AI to be sustainable, we need to not just think about trying to produce, help with sustainability, try and, for example, predict where energy use will be, or try and choose what pipeline we use for our energy, but also think about the production of AI across that pipeline, all the way from the mining of rare earth metals down to the taking apart and disposal of our ICT products, which is often done in quite a dangerous way. And that was the same idea behind our proposal for a triple bottom line. So myself and some others proposed that when we're evaluating translation technologies, we shouldn't just look at performance, how well it performs on some sort of scale. Instead, we need to think of people, planet, and performance all of equal weight. So looking at all those people across the slide here, the creators, the translators, the annotators, what effect does it have on them? Is it negative? And looking at the impact on the environment in terms of CO2 emissions, in terms of the rare earth mining, in terms of disposal, all across that whole life cycle, the water use, for example. And if we have two systems that produce roughly equal quality in terms of performance, well, surely we should choose the one that has less environmental impact or doesn't impact more negatively on people. So in teaching about AI ethics, we use case studies, we have lectures that introduce ethical concepts that lay theoretical foundations, but then that can be quite dry. So for students, it's more interesting to practice ethical analyses using case studies and asking them to describe the key ethical issues and the stakeholders involved, maybe what ethical theories could provide them with some guidance. Guidelines from translator codes of ethics, are they useful or are they just a fig leaf? Are there legal issues involved in this scenario? And with those questions in mind, are there actions that they could propose to resolve scenarios in an ethical manner? We also use the idea of implicated subjects that came from a book by Michael Rothberg and was adopted by my colleague here in DCU, Audrey Bryan, who you can see on the right. And she talks about us as implicated subjects being both beneficiaries and perpetuators of systems that aren't of our own making. And she proposes a mapping exercise to help discuss in class our interconnected self-implication to prompt self-reflection. And she uses this thing called the social ecology of responsibility framework as a visualization to understand the extent of our ethical agency. So here's us at the bottom as our implicated subject. We're beneficiaries, we're perpetuators, but we have a lot of pressures on us to use technologies to behave in certain ways from within our microsystem, our close family, the people we work directly with, more broadly, our wider family, our school, our workplace, working within an ecosystem of an industry, of big tech, being advertised at, and our political macro system. And within all these, we could use this as an excuse to completely absolve ourselves of responsibility. All of these different responsibility levels are above us, or we can try and work out what the extent of our ethical agency is, what decisions can we make, and how might that change across time. And looking at the potential future impacts of the technologies we use, the ecological tipping points, the possibility of AGI, mass extinction events at the very extreme end of things, looking at the impact on people, the impact on the planet, what potential changes can we introduce? So the intention isn't to prevent the use of AI, but to empower students to come to their own individual ethical position on the debates and issues and ethics for translation. As Raquel Ben Buchanan Fitch, who you can see here on the right, said, it's crucial for students to practice ethical decision making, so when they have ethical decisions to make in the real business world, they have a framework to follow. And that here in DCU comes within this broader idea of transversal skills that was proposed within UNESCO to try and inculcate this sort of broader set of skills that are transferable in a sort of uncertain, unscripted future for our students that involves critical thinking, creative thinking, ethical decision making, leadership, communicative competences, digital and data literacy, and personal agility and resilience. The way we teach has changed. There's long been a move away from transmission lectures. This cone of experience from Dale was from 1946, where that long ago he was saying that there's only a certain amount remembered from the verbal, from lectures, from symbols. But as we move down to recordings, motion pictures, involving the students more towards direct, purposeful experiences, there's more that they'll learn. Eric Angelone, who I think is here in the audience, I think I saw you mentioning, asking a question earlier, Eric. He wrote in our book about deliberate practice, which is something that all of us as editors immediately scooped up and used in our own practice. So these are strategically designed activities to improve performance. So the conditions that Eric says that are required for this to be successful are intrinsic learner motivation. For them to be intrinsically motivated is always important. Focused, self-directed performance monitoring, informative feedback, structured tasks that are at an appropriate difficulty level, and learners having the opportunities to correct errors. And this idea of learners having the opportunities to correct errors is key increasingly in our assessment, which I'll come to in a couple of moments. Another thing to think about is the hidden curriculum. It's not just what we tell our students, like parenting, it's also what we do ourselves, and they very much feed on that. We try to incorporate project-based and experiential learning. So for the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a lot of simulated translation bureaus across translation programs where students set up their own translation bureau or company, and they can work with other bureaus internationally across the international network of 21 odd programs. There's a link there, instb.eu. So our students, for example, have done projects with students in the Netherlands and in Italy. And they take on different roles. They can do real or fictitious work. It can be paid or most usually unpaid, because we don't want to compete with real translators, but it tries to give them a certain amount of semi-professional experience. We bring in challenge-based learning, trying to give them challenges to use their knowledge towards. And post-COVID, many of us have ended up learning about the sort of models for online learning, like community of inquiry, trying to bring a teaching presence, a social presence, and a cognitive presence to try and help people online learn in a holistic way. And it's something we actually used in the last couple of months, myself and a few colleagues. We've been teaching just using WhatsApp and very small file sizes for a group of students in Gaza whose university was destroyed. And this came in really handy. So for the simulated translation bureaus, these are significant for students in lots of different ways. They can bring things like translation terminology together rather than the way we teach them separately. They learn how translators and terminologists can fit together in the workplace. It empowers them to make decisions and implement them. They learn pitfalls and good practices with constant help from lecturers and real practitioners. And what we find in the feedback from students' work placements is that this module comes in really handy. So maybe at the time they mightn't have seen the benefit, but afterwards they'll say, well, actually, that was really useful to me. And we're having to change how we assess, not just in response to AI, but partially. I mean, we have to understand the characteristics of AI essays and help students to understand that they're no fun to mark, but also that they really don't get any benefit from using AI. It produces very dull derivative output in terms of student essays, often with still with non-existent references. We're bringing in more in-class exercises, not just summative assessment, the end of modules, but formative, so that they get feedback that they can use as the module progresses. We use reflective assignments that bring their own experience and opinion in, rather than just having an essay based on a topic, and more oral examinations and interactive orals. So this is a two-way, free-flowing, unscripted conversation that really tests students' knowledge, and they flow from our prompts or genuine, natural questions. So in closing, the language industry, it's changing, and training programs are continuing to change with them. Speaking to educators across the European Masters in Translation Network and across the globe, we really try to be flexible, and most academics are very committed. Universities are slow. If we try and change the name of our program, it might take 2 years, but we do our best within those limits. But our role isn't to try to provide trained post-editors to sort of fulfill the narrow skill gap at any one time, but rather graduates who are flexible, who can think critically, who can understand technologies at a high level and understand how we interact with them. And that's it. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Josh. As Belen commented, we have the future generation of linguists in good hands. Yeah. And maybe I will open the question period by selfishly asking a question first myself, because I can, as the moderator of the day. And here is something that has been on my mind and in my focus for quite some time now. There is a perceived gap between academia and business, right? So at the upcoming Gala conference, there is a whole panel and deep dive about, the gap between what the academia, like what kind of workforce the academia prepares and what the actual needs of business are. How do you work on closing that gap? I'm a representative of business, right? So what would you say to companies, translation agencies, translation bureaus, as you call them, like what do you need from them to be able to educate the next generation of language professionals so that they can jump into the work from day one?
Oh, by the way, bureaus is only the term we use for those, for the bureaus in that module. I don't know of any translation agency that calls themselves a bureau.
I
probably
know of
haven't
one.
for about 30 years. Okay. I mean, for us, we just try and work closely with people in the language industry. I mean, for us, that's also helpful to have placements for our students, but also, we're constantly trying to recalibrate, and it makes things more interesting. As researchers, we are also required to work on industry projects. So, for example, a couple of years ago, when Microsoft were looking at potentially using machine translation for the user interfaces for Microsoft Office, then they had targeted projects with us when Anna Gerberov, who is now in Groningen but was working with us for a time, was doing tests with users to see what the effect of machine translation interfaces were, and seeing how that worked with performing a task to see if that made the task slower. So it was very much task-based evaluation. We've had master's students that have done placements and have actually worked on a research project, for example, with We Localize. So we try and work closely with the industry through the EMT network. We have the language industry group that loads of you here are very much involved with. I can see a picture of Yota in front of me, for example, and Balázs Keys from MemoQ. So, that's our way, I suppose, to try and bridge the gap. We constantly bring in people from industry, and that's something I see across the European Masters in Translation Network. I think that the perception that we're working on an entirely different plane to the so-called real world is very much overstated.
Thank you. I was hoping for such an answer. Yes, thanks. Let me pass on the word to Magda, our Q&A moderator. I see there are questions in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Joss. I'm pretty sure a lot of things resonated with our audience. Actually, I have a cousin, he's starting translation next year. And similar to the last question in the chat, I've heard from a cousin what are like the fears of entering translation in such time as the one we are living. But in your experience, what are the main hopes and the main fears that you are seeing from the students right now?
They really don't seem that fearful, actually. Yeah. I mean, they're worried about AI, like I think all students are. And we have a fear that they come in wanting to be translators and we turn them into something else. So, we worry sometimes that we shouldn't call our program translation studies or translation technology, because while we produce maybe translation technologists, we don't really produce translators other than English, Irish. But on the other hand, our graduates seem happy and energized by the idea of doing work that's at this, these really interesting intersections of languages, of cultures, of people, technology, and they're interested and motivated. So they're fearful, not specifically about translation, but more about an uncertain future and about the way workplaces are. Especially because there's a lot of big tech companies here, and a lot of US companies, and there's a feeling from the students that if they progress through those, that all of a sudden there might be a random decision that will mean that they're out, and it won't be down to their good or bad work. It'll just be down to someone in another country a long distance away. So that's certainly a fear that, I had a meeting with a student last week who was talking about this. She's interviewing at the moment, and this is a worry of hers, but she would have worried about that probably whether she did our program or not.
Thank you so much. Actually, can we take one more, Marina? We have 1 minute.
We have 1 minute for one more.
Okay, so we just got like another question via the chat, which is like, Joss, if you could please share again which countries or universities is the STP system used?
So that's the link I just posted in the chat, International Network of Simulated Translation Bureaus.eu. And you can have a look. There's all the publications of the network, and the list of universities is there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jos. Thank you very much for this insightful talk and for sharing with us how the education is evolving. That was very insightful, and we feel very good that the future generations of language professionals are in your hands and the hands of your colleagues. Thank you. And
Thanks,
now I'm going to invite our next speaker to the stage. And our next speaker is actually at the forefront of another major change, and that is the move from written text to speech. AI-generated voices and audio, they have become more and more common, as I'm certain everybody has noticed. So now the question is, what is the role of the traditional linguists when we move from text to speech? So let me welcome to the stage Cristina Contini, who is the Chief Operations Officer at Voiceit. Cristina has almost 2 decades of experience in localization, and she's a champion for linguistic quality and cultural nuance in AI-powered voice. So voice is the keyword here. So she is here to show us today how language professionals can find new opportunities and thrive in the world of voice-driven communication. And in a moment of pure irony, for a talk about AI and voice, Cristina actually lost one thing today. She lost her actual voice because of a cold that hit exactly today. So we will give the word to Cristina to try to practice the lost voice, maybe find it. Yeah, as if the voice disappears completely, we won't be using an AI-generated avatar. Instead, we decided to stay on the human side. So the think tank's very own Andrea Balista will be stepping in to present those parts of Cristina's talk where the voice is gone. Thank you, Cristina, for being here despite having a cold.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you very much. I'm really sorry for the inconvenience, but as you were saying, unfortunately, I managed to catch a cold, and my voice is, let's say, not really reliable today or conference ready, which, as you were mentioning, is quite ironic considering that the speech is about the shift from text to voice and AI voice technology. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of you from the AI Localization think tank for the opportunity to be here alongside so many brilliant people. And also a special thank you to Andrea, who very kindly stepped in today and will act as my backup voice for, I think, most part of the presentation. I will try to cover the introduction and then hopefully the wrap up at the end. So this is what we're going to talk about today. So from text to voice, the new role of linguists in the age of AI speech. Really sorry for the voice, guys. So as I mentioned, this presentation will focus on the shift from text to voice and on the evolving role of language professionals in the age of AI speech. When AI-generated voices are becoming a core part of the multilingual communication, linguists are now in a kind of unique positioning to guide, to refine, and also to elevate the synthetic speech, ensuring that it is natural, it is engaging, and it is especially culturally appropriate for the target audience. So in this session, we will explore how language professionals can expand their skills and in order to work with AI voice technologies, maintaining the linguistic quality, the emotional authenticity, and also the cultural relevance, which while also, unlocking new opportunities in the growing field of voice-driven localization. So let's start with the introduction to this topic. So as we have all noticed, we are now living in the moment where content is being produced at an unprecedented speed and an unprecedented scale. So every day we see videos, podcasts, courses, and digital experiences are created faster than ever before and in more languages than ever imagined. This explosion of content is not just a challenge, it's now an opportunity, and it should be an opportunity for all language professionals. Because for decades, audiovisual localization has relied on the human dubbing, on voiceovers, and on complex post-production workflows, which are very effective and can provide the highest quality possible. But these methods cannot keep up with today's demand for speed, for scale, and for accessibility. This is where AI speech technology now comes in, and not as a replacement, but as a powerful extension for the craft of linguists. So today we will explore how AI is transforming localization, how it is giving voice to content and communities that were previously unheard, and most importantly, how linguists are becoming central to shaping this new era of multilingual and of immersive communication. And with that, Andrea, it's better that I leave it to you so that people can hear better than with my voice.
So, super sorry. Let me just help Cristina and be the voice of Cristina for a while. Okay. Hope you can see me and hear me. And after the Cristina intro, we are basically able to switch to another time. So from limitation to opportunity. So basically the high content volume opens new possibilities beyond human only dubbing. So AI is enabling rapid voice generation across multiple languages, and content that was previously too niche or too costly to localize now can be voiced. Minor languages and underserved audiences can finally be included. The goal is to expand reach and accessibility. Of course, this is super interesting, and it's important to try to understand that we were talking before about languages, written languages, and now with voice, everything is really moving even faster. So the idea is basically to voice the unvoiced. So AI speech enables access and inclusion by reaching people who were previously excluded, not because content didn't exist, but because it wasn't accessible in the right format or language. So let's say we can say that AI speech enables content delivery in underrepresented and minority languages. And this is for sure another topic that we were already addressing in the panel, supports inclusion across education, media, and digital platforms, and turns text into engaging and spoken experiences. So let's take a look about the redefinition of audiovisual localization workflows, since let's say that for a lot of time, the only possibility was to use human in the studio, and definitely the first step of the traditional workflow was translating a script. And of course, translating a script is different than translating an on-screen text. After the script, need to step into the voice casting and then organize the studio recording. And then, of course, while the recording, was going on, some editing, and also after the recording to organize all the material, and then step into the post-production. In the AI-driven workflow, things are substantially similar, but there are some differences. Of course, you can define an AI-driven workflow can be included in the platform or not, but translation is definitely on the top of the list and is becoming even more relevant for proper adaptation. Then, of course, in some cases, AI can offer an automatic AI-driven casting, trying to replicate and find the best voice in the target language. Then there's AI voice generation. AI voice generation is a step that is very important, since basically the language technology platform can offer to who is using the platform a potential take that can be used into the process. This can also be triggered multiple times, and then with a rapid iteration, define what is the target of the, let's say, of the line, and then arrive to a kind of scalable delivery. So this led the possibility to faster turnaround times, and then lower production cost and speed, easier updates and versioning, and a greater flexibility in tone, style, and voices. Localization is becoming a more dynamic, scalable layer of content creation. It is basically migrating in the cloud. So it's basically a huge shift, not just for translation, but also for how we take the words and then we associate to them a voice and we generate speech in another language with all the cultural nuances that we have been already seeing in the previous conversations. So this is a real shift. Content is no longer fixed, it's dynamic. This leads to a bigger shift of all the processing, since localization is evolving from text to experience. This is why culture is one of the value that we know, since we know that AI is not able to get experiences. So this is essential to have human in the process to re-leverage the output of the language technology platform to find out the best way to meet the requirements of the brands and the publisher. And focusing is shifting from written accuracy to spoken experiences. The tone, the rhythm, and the clarity becomes essential, and audio adds emotion and engagement. We are saying very special words since emotion is what is common to all of us. At the same time, thanks to experience and the culture, we deliver emotion and engage in a different way. So maybe we can talk about the similar emotion, but a different way to deliver emotion. So language becomes part of the overall user experience and to fit the cultural engagement. Content is becoming more and more voice enabled by default at the multiple level, automatic and real time and scripted content. So what is the new role of language professionals? Okay, and this is a very interesting topic since AI is transforming localization and the role of language profession is evolving, as we were seeing with Josh, from translators to multilingual language experts that are basically expert also of culturalization and try to find the best way to deliver content and experience in another language. From text adaptation to voice and experience design, since we need to adapt the text and make it sound as possible natural for the target language. And of course, adapting for the voice in the best way so that the experience of the engagement groups and the target groups are, say, at the same level of the source and is responsible for ensuring naturalness, cultural nuances, and emotional impact. Emotional impact is very important also because, as we were saying before, not all the way to express emotion is the same. So this is why we are in the hands of people that need to really redefine the way the voice and the speech are delivered to the users. Curators of tone, styles, and audience engagement, linguists are becoming more and more influential in the localization process and add some value that can be really, really authentic. They're bringing real experience of the culture and trying to deliver the best user experience. So, language, as we said, is an experience, is no longer only read, is heard. So the naturalness, the tone, and the flow are becoming critical. Voice become part of the brand identity. We've been always thinking about the language of the brand, and of course, to have the voice of the brand in terms of real speech is something that is adding one layer of complexity and try to bring the text as a living entity that is basically can be delivered to the audience. The content must sound authentic and engaging, and this is extremely important to preserve, let's say, the cultural bond with what is delivered. And linguists ensure the quality beyond the literal meaning. And this is extremely important, okay? We have seen in the panel how much this can be, let's say, biased, not just since we have an LLM, we are a speech language model behind us. And the speech language model bias can be really very, very important and need to be mitigated when you are delivering content to the target audience. So the language professionals shape how content feels, not just what is merely said. So this is basically moving the creativity in the age of AI. When AI handles the repetitive work, humans can focus on what makes language powerful: emotion, and storytelling. New opportunities are in the voice design and tone definition, since we need to define the proper voice for the proper audience, for the proper target language. The script adaptation for spoken content is becoming massively important. We know, all of us, one thing, language, one other spoken language, but when shifting from voice, you have the time. The time is definitely super important, since especially when you have sync and you have videos, they say the translation need to be adapted to maintain not just the cultural nuances, but also the timing. And this is becoming part of the multilingual content strategy for brands and publishers that want to, say, re-leverage engagement in the of the global perspective. So quality control of AI generated output is also becoming super important. Okay, and new roles are emerging beyond traditional translation. And of course, this is a message to Josh, and of course, happy to speak and to proceed for, let's say, improving the bond between the two things, and business. So basically, we are seeing the new generation of professional coming out, and voice is becoming a core part of the user experience. This shift is opening new opportunities for linguists with roles that are becoming increasingly essential, like AI speech editors. And these are the ones that can definitely take and re-leverage the content created by the language technology platform and bring to the proper delivery system for the brands and the publisher requirements. AI dubbing director. So when you need to really not just deliver let's say a spoken and documentary style element, but you need to push to the limit the emotion of the platform, then you need to have AI speech directors, AI directors that need to really craft the content in the best way possible. And definitely, we can also call them cultural ambassador, that these are the people that are bringing the culture from the source to the target through the language and the speech and the voice. And then, of course, proof listener to ensure that the output of the generated AI system is absolutely accurate and ready for be delivering for the other audiences and for the proper target. So we are basically shaping the AI voice experience, and we would love to go which are the skills that are needed to upskill and upgrade the possibility for the linguist that is usually working in the text domain to jump into the AI generated voice domain. We are going beyond translation, and this is becoming important to not just take care about the glossary or the terminology, but also how you pronounce terminology. Pronunciation is a key element that is really important, since you need to pronounce the name of the brands, of the characters, of the places in a consistent way that is absolutely in sync with the audience. The other things that we need to take care is how we push the pauses of our sentences, and we need to understand when we break the sentences in tokens, how the pauses can be distributed. Of course, also the emphasis is becoming more and more relevant. So I need to, let's say, to pause and to put the, let's say, the focus on some words rather than others. And definitely the emotion and the style are becoming super important. And we will see how this can be achieved through the language technology platform, and then how you can deliver this to the audience. And the reading pace is also becoming super important, since you can be faster and shorter, especially when you're talking about adaptation. So you need to find the best compromise between the source text, target text, adaptation for the cultural nuances, and the pace. If you break the pace, you break the user immersive experience. And of course, everything has to be in sync with the source. Since if you have a video, you have a face, you have a scene, very quick rhythm, and all the things can be explicit and implicit in sync with the source. This professional now shape not just what is said, but how this is experienced. So I don't know if Cristina maybe have more voice, okay, but definitely I'm waiting for a sign anytime. And I would love also to pass very quickly an example of an AI speech editing tool that at the beginning, if you're talking about, let's say, the end-to-end process, we are thinking about a video that can be ingested in a platform. And when you ingest the platform in the video, you need to analyze what is the sound and what is the video, take the sound and let's say, of course, separate the speech with the music, then transcribe automatically the speech into text and do what we call text segmentation. Text segmentation is really important since the speech is usually driven by lines, and how the lines are delivered is becoming a center of importance to try to craft basically the script approach line by line. Also, we need to capture what is the expression of the source and the emotion of the source. And this can be done through a certain type of technology that can definitely analyze not just the text, but how the text is spoken. And this is super, super important. Once this has been captured by the system and by the platform, we can create what we call the script template. Then, when we have the script template, we can go through the translation phase, and the translation phase will land through a mixture of LLMs, machine translation, or of course adaptation, okay? And this depends from how the platform is open to translation system. Definitely, this is the AI speech editing, say, ground. So you can understand, you can generate inferences, you can define the pronunciation, you can associate the specific emotion, okay, that can be different from language to language, and you can also do is called a kind of full conditioning to transfer the source emotion into the target. Then at the end of the process, you can enter what we call editing tool, the mixing environment and finalization stage, in which you do the fine-tuning, positioning of the segments of the audio and the video, and then, of course, preparing for exporting. So this is basically an overview of the platform. There's another very important topic that is very, say, absolutely important, since how we can remunerate this work. We have been going through ages, I say ages, years and years of paper words. Then we have the translation memory came into the play. Then we have the LLM, the machine translation, and the post-editing. But the pricing model, if you're talking about the video, is usually based on minutes of source video. Okay, these are standard practice of the market. The language factor is absolutely relevant, since if you're talking about the language technology platform, usually the technology has no bias in terms of, let's say, the economy system of a single territory. But in some cases, okay, like for the real recording, some territories can be more expensive than other. And this is following, okay, the general say figures for the standard, let's say, localization. So rates can vary depend on the target language. The content complexity is definitely the other elements that is not standardized. It's not just words. How much does it take to create the say desired output? And this depends from other elements like soft timing, voiceover project. So if you do not have to deal with the sync, in other cases, you have to deal with strict timing when you have the lip syncing, and you have some sync projects. And of course, pronunciation, casting, expressivity can be super important elements to contribute to how these efforts of the AI speech editors can be remunerated. Like example, we can have podcasts, tutorials, documentaries, lip sync and sound sync videos. And sound sync videos requires more efforts than, of course, podcasts and tutorials. So with closing thoughts, I hope that Cristina can let us go through all of them.
Let me try.
Yeah.
So thank you, Andrea. I'll try to wrap up now the presentation with some closing thoughts. So let's start with what AI can do and cannot do, and let's be clear about that. AI as we know, is extremely powerful, especially when it comes to generating content at scale or producing multiple versions very quickly. It can take text and turn it into speech, into audio in minutes across multiple languages. And this is simply something that we couldn't do before. But at the same time, AI has clear limitations that we all know. So it does not truly understand the cultural context, the subtle nuances, the emotional intent, and also the audience expectation. And therefore, AI can't make context-aware creative decision. So it can generate something that is correct, but not necessarily that it feels right for that target. And that difference is really critical, because when we talk about communication, I'm sorry, what matter is not just accuracy, but it's the connection, it's the engagement. And this is exactly where linguists come in with voice. So linguists can bring cultural awareness, they can bring sensitivity to tone, they can bring the ability to adapt the language to the context, and also the judgment to make the right choices. So as a few last takeaway, let's say that we know that AI is transforming audiovisual localization, as you have gone through the presentation, that the shift goes beyond technology, because it's about access, it's about inclusion, it's about the ability to give voice to more content, more languages, more people. And so the role of linguists is evolving. So from translation, translating text only, to shaping the voice, shaping the tone, and shaping the experience. So from working at the end of the whole process to becoming a central part of the process. So it needs to be taken as a new opportunity for the language professional, an opportunity to expand skills, explore new roles, and also have a greater impact on how content is experienced globally. So rather than asking what will AI change, I think that the more important question could be, how do we want to be part of this change? Thank you so much, everyone. And sorry again for my poor voice today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cristina, for the content, the beautiful slides. Thank you, Andrea, for being Cristina's voice. And thank you both for showing us the new frontiers in voice technology and the role that linguists have to play in it. We again heard about the culture. We heard about the human touch that is becoming more important than ever. We have some questions, I'm sure, in the chat. So let me pass on the word to Marta, who is gonna share them with you.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Cristina and Andrea. Indeed, we do have some questions, and there have been like some conversations going on, meaning that this was like very relevant to bring to today. So I'll try for the 1 minute that we have to try to summarize and ask one question. So what I understand so far is that AI voice technologies are creating more work that was done before. And it's actually going to serve an unmet need, not displacing the traditional dubbing we have seen, and not displacing professional linguists. But of course, we understand this may raise concerns to the community. So my question is that we are seeing new opportunities. What do you think is actually, or what skills, or what's going to be like the specific role of those traditional linguists and these new opportunities, especially if AI can handle, as we were saying, this repetitive work and repetitive task, how do we see the current teams of linguists addressing and keeping them busy, as well as upskilling?
Yeah, this is, I don't know if you can hear me, but definitely this is the core question. I get it. At the same time, we see that this is coming. This is an opportunity. This is the opportunity to voice what has not had a voice before. Okay, and definitely this will have an impact. Of course, society and regulation will impact this, and everything has to be ethics. So it's important that all these companies and process and this industry is able to, let's say, evolve at the level of awareness that we are touching anyway the work of people. This is a new tool. So I think that we should not be afraid. Embrace the challenge, at the same time understand this is very powerful, but there's still a lot to do, and human has the experience. Human are the one that can choose what is the best take to deliver. And in the voice, since there are 1,000 ways to say, how are you today? I think that human value can be represented more completely to define how we can exchange culture and be as inclusive as possible. That's my hope, let's say. Sorry, but
Thank you very much, Andrea. I'm afraid that we have to move on to our last speaker for today. Thank you both so much
thank you,
for
Cri.
presenting
Thank
here.
you all.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Yes. And let's move to our final speaker, who is going to explore this idea of the human contribution even further. Because in a world where AI can generate translations, the question is, what work is there left for the humans to do? And Daniel Sebesta, who I'm calling to stage, is going to explore these questions. Daniel is a translator, he's a researcher, he's a business advisor, and he is also an unstoppable world traveler. So I really wonder where Daniel is right now, on which continent and in which country. Daniel has done a lot of stuff and he's traveled a lot, and he has this 360-degree view of the industry. So I want to warmly welcome Daniel Sebesta to tell us about how translators can work with AI and still remain creative.
Thank you very much, Marina, for the kind introduction. I happen to be in my home city of Prague, and I'm enjoying such moments very much. So now, if this conference were to be a newspaper for some reason, this presentation would be an opinion piece in that newspaper, an opinion piece based on what I have seen in the more than 20 years that I have spent in this industry, what I have seen in the 10 or so years we have spent with practicable machine translation, and certainly what I have seen in the last 4 years or so of living and working alongside present day generative AI. Hopefully with a view to a future we want to shape. For those who don't know me, my name is Daniel Sebesta, and I wear many hats in language services. There's my linguistic side. I'm a practicing linguist, a sworn and certified translator in several countries, and I work with language hands-on every single day. Then there's my tech side. I write about language AI. I used to be the administrator of ATA's language technology division. And finally, there is my business side. I've been running a business in language services for decades. I hold an MBA in pricing and strategy, and I consult with LSPs, toolmakers, and freelancers on their pricing questions. Let's jump right in, because we do have a lot to cover, even though you wouldn't be able to tell from this slide, which is my only real slide. Let me start with a claim that all of you have heard and perhaps repeated yourselves. AI makes translation faster, cheaper, more productive. And on the surface of it, that claim is obviously true. If you compare a fully manual workflow with a workflow that incorporates neural machine translation or large language models, the difference in raw output speed is undeniable. Drafts appear instantly, the blank page disappears. Large volumes can be processed in a fraction of the time it used to take. And from the perspective of buyers, this often translates directly into lower cost per word, shorter turnaround times, and the ability to scale multilingual content much more aggressively than ever before. And I'm not here to argue against that. But I do want to suggest that this framing of AI as a tool for speed, cost reduction, and productivity is incomplete in a way that matters. It treats translation simply as a pipeline that can be infinitely optimized. Input goes in, output comes out, and the goal is to make that process in between faster and cheaper. And if that is your model of the work, then everything that follows makes perfect sense. Translation post-editing, automation of steps, quality scoring, pricing pressure. But that model quietly assumes that the nature of the work itself stays the same. And that is precisely where I think a shift is happening. What AI changes is not just how fast we produce translations, but what the act of translating actually consists of. It changes how decisions are made. It changes where attention is directed, what kind of effort is required, and absolutely crucially, who gets to control the process. If you only look at speed and cost, you miss all of that. You miss that many linguists today are no longer primarily writing, but evaluating. You miss that cognitive effort is not disappearing, but being redistributed. Redistributed often into more, not less, demanding forms of judgment. And you miss that the introduction of AI into workflows is not just a neutral technical upgrade, but something that reshapes this balance of control between the linguists, the clients, and the intermediaries. Control over the process, the tools used, and the workflow. So the question I want to explore today is not whether AI makes translation faster. It clearly does. The question is, what kind of work is translation becoming under these conditions? And is it work people actually want to do? This brings me to a term that has quietly shaped how the entire industry thinks about this shift, and that is post-editing. Post-editing of conventional machine translation, post-editing of AI output, which all sounds technical, harmless, just a description of a workflow. The machine produces something, the human professional refines it afterwards. Nothing immediately controversial about that. But if you look at it more closely, the term does something quite powerful. It encodes a certain hierarchy. Post-editing implies that the primary act has already happened, that the translation exists, the machine has done the real work, and what remains is secondary, editing, polishing. The human professional enters the process late and operates within boundaries that have already been set. And that framing matters because, as we know, language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes how we structure workflows, how we price work, how we assign responsibility. If the human is just post-editing, then the work can be decomposed into smaller units. Segments can be isolated. Quality can be approximated through automated scoring. Effort can be estimated in advance and compressed into per-word pricing models that assume some form of uniformity. And speed becomes the dominant metric because the human is no longer seen as creating meaning, but as fixing deviations from an already acceptable baseline. From there, a whole set of downstream consequences follows almost automatically. Pricing pressure intensifies because polishing is perceived as less valuable than creation. Standardization increases because variability is treated as inefficiency. And workflows become optimized for throughput, often at the expense of context, nuance, and ultimately quality. The deeper issue is not economic, it is conceptual. because if you actually look at what skilled linguists do in these workflows, post-editing is a poor description of the activity. What they're really doing is continuous evaluation and decision-making. They're assessing whether the output is fit for purpose, whether it aligns with intent, whether it is consistent with what came before and what comes after. They're restructuring context that the system does not fully reveal or even have. They are, in many cases, making creative choices only within constraints they did not have a chance to help define. So the label post-editing makes the human contribution look smaller than it is. And importantly, it makes it easier to design workflows where the human expert is positioned as an interchangeable final step rather than as someone who should have influence over the process from the very beginning. Once you accept that framing, it is much harder to argue for more control, more context, or a different distribution of the value created. If we set aside the label post-editing for a moment and just look at what actually happens during the work, we see a different picture. Traditionally, translation was framed as a form of writing. You start from nothing in the target language and you construct a text line by line. The cognitive effort is oriented towards production, finding the right words, shaping the sentence, building rhythm, resolving ambiguity as you go. Even when constraints are tight, it is an act of creation. That model is no longer dominant in many AI-driven workflows. What has replaced this is not the absence of work or effort, but a shift in the center of gravity. The primary activity is no longer writing, it is choosing. You are presented with machine output, sometimes one option, sometimes several, and your task is to evaluate, is this acceptable? Is this accurate? Does this align with tone of voice, with terminology, with prior decisions, with the broader communicative goal? And if not, what needs to change? How far do you need to go? This form of evaluation is not a lighter form of writing. In many cases, it is cognitively more demanding than writing. The work is less about generating language, obviously, and more about judging it. And that has two important implications. If the core activity is decision-making and the core skill is judgment, then expertise becomes more and not less important, because bad decisions are easy to make when everything looks plausible. And second, the conditions under which those decisions are made becomes critical. If you remove context, if you fragment the text, if you incentivize speed over reflection, you're not just making the work less pleasant, you are systematically degrading the quality of those decisions. So the key question is not how much writing is left in translation. It is, what does it mean to make good judgment calls in this AI environment? And where are we actually designing workflows that allow good decisions to happen? If we accept that the core activity is shifting away from writing, generating, creating, to choosing and evaluating, then the next question is, what happens to creativity? Because one of the more persistent narratives in the industry is that creativity is being squeezed out, that once you move into AI-mediated workflows, especially anything labeled as post-editing, the work becomes mechanical, reactive. Some would even call it mind-numbing. And there is some truth to that under certain conditions. But I think that conclusion would be too quick. What is actually happening is not that creativity disappears. It relocates. It takes a different shape. I strongly believe that creativity can have many different forms. And I find that a useful way to think about this shift is through a simple metaphor, that of gardening versus sculpting. AI is fundamentally a generator of possibilities. You give it a prompt, you give it some context, maybe some linguistic assets, and it produces options for fragments, sentences, entire drafts. In that sense, it behaves like a gardener. It creates abundance. It grows options, often more than you strictly need, sometimes messy, sometimes surprising, sometimes unusable, but often exactly right, and occasionally even better than you would have thought of. In this setup, the human expert plays a different role, not the one who plants every seed and waters it for hours, but the one who decides what branch stays and what leaf goes. The one who cuts away, refines, reshapes, and brings something into focus. That is sculpting, in my mind anyway. And importantly, sculpting is not a secondary or lesser form of art or of creativity. It is a different one. Think of a sculptor working with a block of stone. The material is already there. The task is not to add, to create by generating more of that material, but to remove anything that doesn't seem to belong. The creative act lies in seeing the form within the material and having the judgment to reveal it. And the same applies here to translation. When you are working with AI-generated output, the creative challenge is to recognize which parts carry potential and which do not, to decide how much to keep and how much to change, to shape something that is coherent and fit for purpose out of a field of possibilities. And this is not trivial. In fact, it often requires more sensitivity than writing from scratch, because you're constantly negotiating between what is given and what is needed. But, and this is where my earlier comments come back in, this form of creativity depends heavily on the conditions presented by the workflow. If you are given rich and varied and largely useful input, if you have access to context, to the bigger picture of what the content is trying to achieve, if the system you work with adapts to your decisions as you make them, then you can actually engage in this sculpting process in a meaningful way. If, on the other hand, you are presented with a single static output fragmented into isolated segments that didn't pass an automated scoring step, with no feedback loop and with strong incentives to move quickly, then the gardening has already been constrained and the sculpting becomes very mechanical. You're no longer shaping possibilities, you're correcting unwanted deviations. So the question is not whether AI leaves room for creativity. The question is, are we designing workflows where humans can actually act as sculptors, or are we reducing them to something much closer to minimum viable quality control? If creativity shifts towards selection and shaping, then we need to ask what makes someone good at that? Because once you move into a world where AI can generate fluent, plausible output at scale, the challenge is not anymore producing language that looks right. The challenge is detecting where it is almost right and why that still matters. And this is where judgment becomes the scarce resource. Large language models are extremely good at producing content that passes a superficial check, at least in the major languages. It reads well, it flows, it sounds like something an educated human might have written. And in many cases, it is good enough to pass unnoticed, especially if you're moving quickly or if you're not deeply familiar with the subject matter. But plausibility is not the same as correctness or fitness for purpose. The real difficulty lies in identifying the subtle issues, the not so obvious errors, the small shifts in meaning, tone, emphasis that accumulate and can distort the message. A term that is technically correct but inconsistent with prior usage, a sentence that is accurate but undermines the intended positioning of a brand, wording that is grammatically flawless but culturally off. These are not things that a checklist will reliably catch. They require interpretation. They require the bigger picture that you're not always incentivized to see. And they require the kind of tacit knowledge that comes from the experience of getting your hands dirty with language work. Such a human expert is capable of making informed decisions about whether the output is acceptable and what needs to change. And importantly, those decisions are not binary. It is rarely a simple yes or no. It is a continuous spectrum of judgment calls. How much effort is justified here? What level of quality is really required? Where do we invest attention and where do we accept certain trade-offs? In that sense, quality is a function of evaluation and judgment, which means that if you design workflows that undervalue or constrain human judgment, if you limit context, if you compress time, if you treat experts as interchangeable, you're not just affecting their working conditions, you're affecting the quality of the output. If judgment is the scarce resource, then the obvious next question is, under what conditions can good judgment actually happen? And this is where we run into a structural problem in many current workflows, what I would call context collapse. A lot of AI-mediated translation today is organized at the segment level. This is obviously not new in the language industry. CAT tools have used segmentation for as long as we can remember. But what is new with AI-powered quality scoring is that you often get isolated segments because an automated quality scoring layer has flagged them as potentially problematic. You are asked to review, correct, and move on. And on paper, this looks efficient. The system assumes that most of the text is good enough, so human attention is only directed where it is most needed. Effort is minimized, throughput is maximized. But this design rests on a key assumption that translation quality can be meaningfully assessed and improved at the level of isolated segments. And in practice, that assumption often breaks down because language does not operate in isolated units. Meaning unfolds across paragraphs and entire texts. Language choices are not just local, they need to be consistent throughout. Tone is not defined sentence by sentence. When you remove that kind of context, you are asking the linguist to make decisions with painfully incomplete information. And add another layer, the fact that you are often only shown segments that are already known to be problematic. That means you are entering the text at its weakest points without seeing how those points connect to anything else. You are expected to fix issues, but you're not given the full picture or the time and incentive to look at it. The result is not just inefficiency, it is a systematic limitation of quality, because even a highly skilled and experienced linguist cannot fully compensate for missing context. They can make reasonable assumptions, but they cannot guarantee coherence across the text they cannot see. And over time, this has another effect. It becomes cognitively draining. You're constantly reconstructing context, second-guessing decisions, aware that what you are producing may quite likely be suboptimal, not because of a lack of skill, but because of the way the work is structured. If we want better outcomes and better work, we need to move beyond this kind of segment level optimization and reintroduce conditions where judgment can actually operate, namely access to the full picture. Now, if you take everything that we have discussed so far, the shift from writing to choosing, the centrality of judgment, the loss of context, you can start to see why a very common claim begins to feel incomplete, namely that AI makes work easier. There's certainly some truth to that. You type less, you're not starting from a blank page, you do not have to construct every sentence from scratch. And when systems are set up well, some repetitive work genuinely disappears. But less typing does not mean less effort. What is happening is a real reallocation of the cognitive load. Effort shifts away from production towards evaluation, and those are not the same. When you write, your attention is more continuous. When you evaluate, your attention fragments. You scan for subtle issues. That requires sustained attention, and sustained attention is cognitively expensive, and over time it leads to decision fatigue. Small decisions accumulate, and eventually you start accepting what is merely plausible because questioning everything is simply too costly. And this gets worse when context, especially the big picture kind of context, is missing. If you're working on isolated segments, if you're not just evaluating, but subconsciously reconstructing what you cannot see. And here's the paradox. From the outside, this kind of work looks more efficient, it looks faster, cheaper, but from the inside, it often feels more exhausting, not because the work is worse per se, but because the effort is different. You're doing less building and more checking. So when we talk about productivity, we need to be precise about what we are measuring, because if we ignore cognitive load, we risk designing workflows that are efficient on paper, but unsustainable in practice. And this brings us to what I see as the central distinction. We need to separate what the technology can do from how it is actually used, because those things are often mixed up. Technically, AI can do a lot. It can generate high quality output, even improve based on feedback. Adaptive workflows are eminently possible. So if you find yourself making the same correction and again, this is not a technical limitation. It's a design choice, how your workflow was built. And this is where capability and control diverge. Many workflows today are static. Pre-translations are generated upfront. Feedback loops are weak. Systems don't adapt. From a technical perspective, that is suboptimal. Static workflows are easier to standardize, of course. They're easier to measure, to manage. They support predictable pricing. They reduce variability, but they also reduce agency. If you, as the linguist, do not control the environment you work in, the model used, the prompt, the assets, the workflow, the most important decisions have already been made for you, and your role becomes reactive. And this is where AI can function as a decoy, in my opinion, because it is easy to say that this is what the technology requires. But often we're looking at it as not a necessity, but it is a choice about how work is organized, about who makes the decisions and who captures the value created. So the real question is not just what AI can do, but who gets to decide how it's used. And if we make that question concrete, and this is in conclusion already, it helps to think in terms of a gradient, not control and agency versus no control and no agency, but degrees of control and agency. At the one end, you have the executor. You receive segments in isolation, you correct what you must, and you move on. No influence, little to no context. And at the other end, you have the designer. You shape the brief in conversation with the end user. You select the linguistic assets that will inform the AI. You write the prompt, you design the workflow itself, and in between executor and designer, you have the participant with some influence, but not full control. The point is not that everyone needs to become a designer. The point is that these levels exist and that workflow design determines where you end up. If we follow that logic, the question is, where do you want to be on that gradient? It's not about what AI can do. It's about what kind of work we want AI to do and what kind of work we want to do. Do we want to operate as executors, optimizing for speed and workflows predefined by people who do not necessarily understand what language work consists in? Or do we want to be active participants or even designers, shaping how that work is done? There's no single answer, and yours might be different from mine, but there is a choice. And if we treat the current trajectory of AI adoption as inevitable, we give that choice away. So the question I will leave you with is simple, not whether AI will change translation. It already has. But within that change, where do you want to stand? And what kind of work do you want to help create? Thank you. And with that, I am certainly open to questions.
Thank you so very much for this very inspiring opinion piece, which was also delivered with a surgical precision. You chose every word so accurately. You basically demonstrated to us what sculpting with language actually means. And I'm not going to take more time because we are slightly over time and we have a lot of questions. So maybe let's take one question and then we'll find a way to answer the remaining two later on somehow. So
Yeah.
Marta, which question will you choose for us from the Q&A panel?
Actually, I'm going to try to combine two so that we try to cover, we have like three great questions. I'm going to try to combine Beba's and Remy's question, which are about, the question is like, would you say that some people are naturally better suited to high quality post editing? That's the term we are using in for lack of a better one, than translation. That's the first part of the question. And the second, once we have an answer, would be, what would be like the three top skills? Like if we see them as two separate roles and skills, what skills do you think that translators, linguist reviewers need to acquire in this new age?
Well, I do think some people are better gardeners than sculptors. So to take that metaphor one step further, or to continue the same metaphor, I do think that some people feel better suited or are objectively better suited for the gardening work, for the generation than the evaluation. It is closer to their nature, perhaps. It is their preference. Either way is valid. Like I said, sculpting is not a lesser form of art. And by the same token, gardening is not a lesser form of art, if we consider gardening an art to begin with. To the other question, the skills that people need to be honing or acquiring for today's workflows, I am not certain that they're substantially different from what they used to be. You know, the judgment calls are different. The judgment comes at a different step in the process, but it's still the same kind of critical thinking, linguistic aptitude in multiple languages, cultural awareness. You just apply the same skills at a different step along the way. So I don't see any fundamental shift in the skills that people need to acquire, really.
Thank you. Thank you for this answer. Thank you, Daniel, and big thanks to all the speakers. What a day has it been? Yeah, we confronted the ethical complexities of monocultural AI. Then we looked at how education and professional roles are evolving, and we ended up with creatively sculpting translations in the age of AI. So please join me in my thanks to our incredible speakers. Huge thank you to all of you also who joined us online. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. It's been such an honor, such a pleasure, and such a joy to be here with you. So this is all for today. I almost feel sad that we have to close for today, but please join us tomorrow for the third day and the last day of the conference. Tomorrow's day is going to be dedicated to technology. So we are going to start with a keynote from Ben Hilak, who is a Silicon Valley founder of an AI startup. And that's going to be followed by a talk from Istvan Lengyel, Emily Diamandopoulou, and the think tank's own Marta Nieto Cayuela. And all of them have hands-on experience with technology, and they're going to share their thoughts and practical secrets with you. So have a very nice rest of the day. See you tomorrow. Looking forward so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you all.